Okay. All right, very good. Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Tardy, tardy, tardy. Okay, so here's a quick question. Certainly until this seminar, how many of you had a favorable, generally favorable impression of government regulation? I want to see a show of hands. Okay, so nobody? Really? Not a single person? All right, well, clearly you are here, so there's a bit of a bias involved. But
with respect to what?
What's that?
With respect to what? Government regulation?
Doesn't matter. Anything. Sorry?
I guess like some regulation is appropriate was my general disposition on regulation.
Yeah, I think this is the way, in general, people still perceive regulation. If you talk to normal people, right? Like all of us who are clearly not normal. If you talk to normal people, they will say regulation is a good thing. It's done to protect the public. It's oftentimes a government response to what?
Market failure.
Right, market failure. Because markets fail, and it's the government that has the not only opportunity, but in fact the responsibility to fix those market failures. And you know, sometimes it would be maybe question on the true effectiveness of government in fixing these government market failures. There is a Freudian slip. And but you know, the very logic of the government intervening into the economy to fix these problems is almost never questioned. Incidentally, notice that the basic perspective is also that the people that work for the government that institute these regulations are acting in public interest, that they are not driven by self-interested pursuits, but are driven by the desire to maximize public welfare, right? So you had a lecture on public choice economics yesterday. Public choice economics clearly, bless you, questions this. Obviously, no political actors are acting in public welfare, right, and public benefit. They are all human beings, and as human beings, they're primarily interested in their own self-interest. Okay, so we have to start from that point. And that's what started happening in the early 1970s. Prior to the early 1970s, the economic profession, in fact, held that regulation was in the benefit of the public. One article seriously challenged that. So what I want to do, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the Chicago approach towards regulation, and then talk about the Austrian approach, all right? So the Chicago approach here is due to one guy, primarily. His name is George Stigler. Stigler won a Nobel Prize, I think sometime in the 1980s. How many of you heard of him before? A few of you. All right, so Stigler is a big name in industrial organization, part of economics. And Stigler in 1971 wrote this article on economic theory of regulation, where he said, you know, it's kind of strange that we apply these beneficial motives, these beneficent motives to the policymakers and the bureaucrats. We really need to stop doing that. And lo and behold, when you stop doing that, you get a very different perspective on regulation than you did previously. And the perspective on regulation that Stigler comes up with is, he says the following. Businesses would love to have cartels. Starts off with that recognition, right? It's basically the recognition that Adam Smith had. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this famous Adam Smith quote, where he says that seldom do businessmen meet, this is paraphrasing, seldom do businessmen meet even but for merriment, that the talk soon turns to conspiracy against the public, right? That they are trying to collude in order to raise prices, increase their profits, right? The thing about it, though, that economists started understanding actually quite a long time ago is that cartels in markets are extremely unstable. Market participants or cartel participants, they cheat. Because once they become part of a cartel, they all have an incentive to actually start lowering the price and trying to capture more buyers for themselves, personally. Okay, it's a classic prisoner's dilemma problem. So market cartels, I mean, we basically do not have a single example of a successful market cartel in the history of, since the Industrial Revolution. Any successful cartel that exists out there or has existed was enforced by the government. And that's Stigler's point, is that regulation really becomes a way for the government to enforce or government to provide cartel enforcement services for businesses that are trying to increase their profits. Okay, so the way that Stigler described this is that the regulation ends up being captured by the regulator. And what does he mean by captured? It means that regulation is actually beneficial for the regulated, which is very different from what I think you often hear. Okay? But the point is this, and I'll explain exactly why both sides can be correct at this particular point. The point is this. By providing particular regulation, that regulation is going to raise the costs of entry, and it's going to oftentimes even new firms starting to compete with the existing firms in a particular market. And they also allow the government to better regulate the price of a product. And the price of the product that's going to be regulated is usually the one that the regulated firms won't. Let me give you a few examples of this, and then I think you'll get the point even better. Until fairly recently in the United States, we had a heavily regulated airline market, air travel market. Okay, there was this organization called the civil, or bureaucracy actually, called Civil Aeronautics Board. And the Civil Aeronautics Board determined which airline would be allowed to fly into which city, how many times, and basically what prices they were allowed to charge. Okay? Now think about that. They would restrict the number of airlines that were permitted to serve a particular city. Why would they do that?
Make it more expensive.
Yeah. Is this beneficial for consumers? It's hard to make that case. They would say, oh, we're making sure that the safety of consumers is first and foremost. Meanwhile, the prices of flying with one of these newfangled jet airliners, they were through the roof. Right? You maybe watch some, I don't know, Mad Men or Pan Am or one of these shows, right? The people that flew a lot, what was the name that we gave them? Jet setters, right? Like these playboys that had more money than brains. They could just burn through money because why else would you be flying on these jet aircraft all the time? It was very expensive to do. It was also quite comfortable, much more comfortable than it is today. The seats were much wider, much more legroom. But of course, the people that paid those prices were quite happy to get those services. All of that's changed now. But check this out. So there was a push by some budget airlines, in particular Southwest, to deregulate this market and to allow basically whatever airline wants to serve a particular city to do so. Who do you think was the main opponent of this deregulatory push? Airlines. That's the key insight here, right? Almost inevitably, what we observe when there is a push for deregulation in any industry, the main opponents of the deregulation will be the current businesses within that industry. Which, if this regulation was truly damaging to them, of course they would be the first ones lining up to get rid of the regulation. But that's not the way it works. Okay? Despite all the odds, the deregulation of the airline industry was in fact pushed through. Anybody know when it happened? And so the Civil Aeronautics Board disappeared. The government no longer decided which airlines were allowed to fly where. They didn't dictate the prices, none of this stuff. When did this happen? Anybody?
73.
What?
1973.
78. That's not too far off. Who was president during that time?
Carter.
Jimmy Carter! Wait, isn't it supposed to be like a big government guy? Who was the main senator behind the push for deregulation? Ted Kennedy. Am I blowing your minds? Okay, Ted Kennedy. What do they call him? The lion of the left or something, the liberal lion. He passed away a few years ago here. But these were the guys that actually pushed through what I would argue is the most significant deregulation in the US history. Nothing like that happened. Nothing as important happened under Reagan, actually. Maybe trucking deregulation, but that may have even been under Carter. So, you had this major deregulatory pushes before Reagan. And it's interesting, actually, it was the airlines that resisted this. Airlines were making tons of profits. If you've been paying attention at all, you'll know that airlines and profits have not really gone together very much over the past 30 years or so. It seems to be quite elusive. But Southwest is doing well, interestingly enough. So that's the first story of regulation and deregulation. Here's another one. Going back about 15 years, what we started seeing a lot is city governments in particular, in some cases state governments, really cracking down on these individual women that were providing basically traditional African hair braiding services, okay, to other black women. And many of these women, they would just operate out of their own home. They didn't do anything else but these hair braiding services. Mostly to the other women in their neighborhoods. Well, I believe this was in Houston, Texas, in around '98 or so. The police showed up at the doors of one of these women, asked her to show them a license that she's allowed to practice cosmetology, which she of course did not have. When she could not produce it, they took her to jail. Do you think her customers were complaining that they reported her? They did not. Who reported her? Licensed salons, right? They were being outcompeted by this woman without a license, and they didn't like it. They were losing customers, at least in this one area, and they reported her to the government, and the government took her away. Now, many states, and sometimes this is done on a municipal level, sometimes at state level, but they have these licensing requirements. And these licensing requirements are, they're justified always that they were going to increase the quality of hair care. That's complete nonsense. In fact, if you look at the quality of healthcare in the states and municipalities that do not have any licensing requirements, they're the same. There is no difference. But these licensing requirements, what they do is massively raise the entry cost. In order to enter this particular market, oftentimes you're not going to have to go through 2 years of beauty school. You may become a beauty school dropout, right? And you will pay a lot of money. It's not unusual to pay $10,000, $15,000 to be able to go through all of this and then pass a rigorous examination. What? Really? Like, you know, if you get a bad haircut, it will grow back. It's not the end of the world. I'm sorry, ladies, it's true, okay? I know you're very protective of your hair, but it does grow back. This is not a nuisance to public health. So how can we justify this particular licensing requirement in all these many places? It's entirely due to this particular special interest group pleading for competitive protection, right? Protection from other competitors. And if there is less entry into that particular market, what do we expect to see in that market?
Increased prices.
Higher prices, of course, and therefore higher profits. Probably the most striking example of that is the New York taxi cabs, all right? How many of you know about this? Okay, just a few of you. How many of you been to New York City in the last, let's say, 5 years? Okay, quite a few of you. Have you noticed that the taxi cabs are not so easy to get? Maybe, did you have any trouble getting a taxi? I bet you if you tried during rush hour traffic, you would have a very difficult time. Here's what's happened with New York taxi cabs. Back, I think, during World War II, the city government mandated that in order to operate a taxi cab, you have to have this medallion. Medallion is, in effect, a license to operate a taxi cab. Initially, they were just given for free, but there was a fixed number of them. And as far as I know, that number has not increased in the last 70 years. What's happened to the population of New York City? Expanded quite a bit. The number of taxi cab stayed the same. Legal taxi cabs anyway, right? So what's happening here? What do you think the effect of this is going to be? Okay, but shortage is only a situation when the price is not allowed to adjust. Prices are allowed to adjust here. So what's going to happen?
Prices are going to go up.
Yeah, very high prices. And many economists have done studies on this, and they've compared cities that have regulations like that, or similar regulations, right, to cities that have no regulations of that sort. Cities with licensing requirements have much higher taxi cab prices than the other cities. It's basically restriction of supply, and that restriction of supply allows the existing providers to charge higher prices and therefore have higher profits. And just to demonstrate how high the profits are from every single one of these medallions, which remember, it's basically, it's a guarantee of a stream of profits into infinity, right? Until this goes away, and the taxi cab operators are going to make sure that medallions will never go away, right? Because they're a powerful special interest group, and they're all benefiting from this. So we have a situation where they're looking at the stream of profits way into the future. You can actually sell these medallions. A medallion guarantees you a stream of profits into the future, into infinity. What do you think the price of one of these medallions is on an open market today?
It's like $1 million.
The last I saw was $500,000. That's a medallion to operate a single taxi cab.
Forever.
All right? Sorry?
Forever.
Well, you get it forever, that's right. But the point is, this single medallion, market participants look at it as properly discounted, that this gives you $500,000 of profit into perpetuity, right? So that's a remarkable thing. And you can see actually there's even online somewhere, I forget, there's a guy that's been following the medallion prices and plotting them, okay? And he just keeps going up, 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 which is of course what you would expect, all right? This is not helping consumers. This is very much helping the producers, the suppliers. Notice this regulation is captured by them for their own benefit, to increase their profits, or to be a little bit more precise, to increase their rents. Right? They are allowed to act as a cartel to raise prices with the government enforcement, which lacking government enforcement, that cartel is going to fall apart. It's not going to persist. But with government enforcement, that cartel can be stable and can in fact charge high prices for a long time make much higher profits at the expense of consumers. Therefore, it's rent-seeking. Yes?
So what about the argument that, oh, if we didn't have these the regulation of this market, we'd have this huge asymmetric information problem. If I got into a taxi, I wouldn't know if the driver had been trained. I wouldn't know
but the
if
medallions don't guarantee any of that, right? I mean, they do not force the taxi cab operators to pass any examinations. Nothing. You just have to buy this medallion. So it's very. What's that?
There's still cabs you can legally get into in New York that you may not.
Listen, I think the most scared I ever was for my life was riding in a legal taxi cab in New York City. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, this guy was like a lunatic. He would punch the gas every time the light turned green, even though he saw like a block away there was another light that was red. And my wife and I were sitting in the back, no seatbelts, and we're like, oh, we're gonna die, The irony in a taxi cab in New York City. So there is absolutely no guarantee of safety here whatsoever. Nobody's even trying to make that case. This is just rent-seeking, pure and simple. Okay. So this is Stigler's point, that special interest groups lobby the government to get protection from regulation, and government will respond by granting them these things. Okay? And you can actually even see special interest groups competing against each other on the political scene, right? Through very opposing lobbying. So one special interest group wants these government protections, the other special interest group wants that, and it's all a matter of who can produce most campaign contributions and most votes. Right? That's how it works. So firms are now, they understand that it's no longer about competing on the marketplace. It's all about competing in the political marketplace. Now, do consumers benefit when firms are competing in the political marketplace? Heck no. All of those resources are completely wasted. Whereas when firms are competing to better serve consumers, they improve operations, right? They have to do things better, more efficiently. They have to be innovative. All of those things allow us to have a higher standard of living. When the competition takes place in the political marketplace, forget it. It's just wasted resources. Okay, so that was the insight that Stigler had, and that really kind of started what came to be known as the Chicago Public Choice School. Okay, Chicago School of Public Choice Economics. There were a bunch of people that followed Stigler's insights. One in particular I wanted to mention, this guy by the name of Peltzman. Oh, sorry, actually, McChesney, rather. McChesney said that government itself can sometimes act as a well-organized special interest group. And what they'll do is they'll sometimes pass vaguely defined statutes, laws, right? And you look at these laws and you go, what's that all about? I don't understand what the purpose of this law is and who exactly it's going to affect. And I think probably the classic example of that is antitrust laws. And I'm going to talk about that tomorrow in more detail, but antitrust laws, incredibly vague, arbitrary. The way that McChesney explained this is that these vaguely defined statutes, it's akin to fishing for business, right? So what they'll do is they'll pass the statute, then sit back and wait. Wait until they see who cries uncle, right? How do people cry uncle? Well, by saying, whoa, hey, we need to talk exactly how you're going to enforce this particular law, because it has the possibility of adversely affecting us. And this is what happens, folks. I'm not just making this stuff up. This is how Washington, D.C. works. So these special interest groups are now going to approach the politicians, and they'll say, we need you to make sure that this particular law is enforced in this way, in a way that actually reduces competitiveness, competition in our market, and allows us to make higher profits rather than penalize us. And the legislators say, I would love to do that for you, but one hand washes the other. right? What will you do for me? And pretty soon, money starts flowing into Washington, D.C., into the re-election coffers of that particular politician, which is why all of these politicians are in particular extremely eager to get on the right committees, because committees have the oversight over the bureaucracies that will enforce these different regulations. They determine what their budgets are going to be. So the politicians will go to the bureaucrats, to the people actually engaging in regulation, and say, I need you to stop enforcing this particular piece of legislature in this way, and I want you to start enforcing it in this way. And pretty soon, there's more captured regulation. Okay, this is what McChesney said: fishing or trolling for business, right? Just throw the net overboard, see what you end up with. And by the way, so even things that you would say, all right, well, this can be good for any business, right? Like, I don't know, cafe standards, for example, which really they increase fuel efficiency mandates by the government. There is actually a way to explain them where some businesses are going to benefit. In particular, I've been reading a lot about this just in the last week or two. The increased accounting requirements, for example, all sorts of disclosure documentation that you have to have now as a business. Think about who's going to be in a better position to be able to provide all of the documentation. Big established business or a small entrant? Obviously, big established business. They'll hire a few more accountants or a few more lawyers. They can afford it. Whereas smaller upstarts cannot. Those smaller upstarts oftentimes will look at this, and there were several letters, in fact, written. This was a couple of articles in the Wall Street Journal in the last few weeks, and some people wrote in letters and said, yeah, in fact, I was operating in this particular business, and then the paperwork requirements became so burdensome that I just folded. I couldn't keep up with it anymore. Meanwhile, all of my bigger competitors, of course, they just hired some more accountants and lawyers. Okay? So even burdensome regulations, like cafe standards or all of these things, which apply to all the businesses equally, can have a beneficial impact on particular businesses by reducing competition that they will see. And that obviously hurts consumers, because we now have fewer competitors fighting to serve us. Prices are going to go up, service is not going to be as good. That was the insight that the Chicago School of Public Choice Economics had, this whole idea of capture theory of regulation. And I think even the left has now started becoming cognizant of this. Even the left is looking and saying, oh my gosh, look at all this financial regulation. That's all, we think that we're going to pit the government against the businesses, right? That it's going to be one power against the other power, and that it's going to sort of equalize the power, right? But instead, what's happening is that big government colludes with big business to screw the rest of us. Okay? So even they are now seeing that and thinking, wow, maybe this is not such a good thing. In fact, more recently, I've been seeing a lot of arguments and articles along these lines made about the Dodd-Frank bill. So the Dodd-Frank bill is this massive new financial regulatory overhaul, most of which, by the way, they said, all right, the government's going to do this, this, and this, but they didn't actually spell out how it's going to do that, how it's going to carry out these regulations. They'll leave that to the regulatory agencies. And a big regulatory agency that has to do all this stuff in the US is going to be the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. So the Federal Reserve is even freaking out themselves. They're actually looking at this stuff that Dodd-Frank bill wanted them to do, and it's a huge list. So they're going through all of this stuff, and they can't keep up with it all. They're way behind schedule. In addition, they're looking at some of this stuff, and they say, we don't actually know how to do this. We do not know how to carry out this regulation. You want us to do this, this, and this. That all sounds nice. How do we do that? We don't know. So what's happened is that financial companies have been consulted by the regulatory agencies and saying, all right, how are we going to do this? And they say, well, we can do it this way. So this is what we've been seeing a lot of. And the left is now decrying that Dodd-Frank bill has basically been captured by the financial companies. That it's not going to be this massive burden that's going to clean up the financial sector. In fact, quite the opposite. There's going to be less competition. There's going to be more opportunity for mischief and more financial crisis in the future. So that's the story of capture theory of regulation. It's not good. And I think more and more people are recognizing that. When you're thinking of the costs of regulation, it's important to always keep that in mind as well. Right? Economists always point out that we only want those things done for which benefits are greater than costs. And it's very difficult to engage in benefit-cost analysis for many, many different things. But at least let's be aware of all of the costs. So if we are talking about regulation, clearly there is the direct cost of funding all of these regulatory agencies, right, and the bureaucracy behind it. There is also the cost that a lot of people have pointed out, the lost energies, right, all of the resources that have to be devoted to complying with the regulations. But maybe even more important than both of these together, is the political cost. The fact that as a result of possibility of regulation, special interest groups are going to engage in massive lobbying to try to capture a particular regulation for themselves. Okay, so if you look at Washington, D.C., that place is not going through a recession, right? They did not go through a recession. There was any kind of a serious decline in property values in Washington, D.C. They're still going up, 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 and away, right? This is an area that's not being affected by everything that's going on in Washington, that's going on in the rest of the country, rather. Okay? Why? Because lobbying, of course, with Obama now talking about the federal government having even bigger role in the economy, that's going to mean more and more money flowing into Washington, D.C. for the regulator to make sure that the regulation is in their benefit. And by the way, I'll give you just one final story on this, supporting McChesney's idea of trolling for business, I guess. But back during the election of 1998, so it was a midterm election, right, not a presidential election, and Clinton was in office. There was a significant development in a few years previous to 1998 in the US. What was going on? The rise of something quite important still today. The internet, of course. All of a sudden, the internet came on the scene and everybody started using it. And internet commerce, e-commerce, started becoming a big deal. And all these Silicon Valley companies in our neighborhood here, they started making tons of money. And these were all computer nerds that knew nothing about the real world, right? All they knew how to do was code. That was it. Well, they were about to get a crash course in reality. I remember this article, front page story of the Wall Street Journal, the summer of 1998, so just a couple of months before the election. And there were a bunch of politicians interviewed about this new phenomenon of internet, and they were just remarkably forthright and honest. And they said that clearly the Silicon Valley, the high-tech industry, is not paying its fair share towards the political process. Cue ominous music, right? And that they will make sure, the politicians will make sure that they start, in fact, paying their fair share. Right? So what that required, basically, is threatening to go after all these companies with antitrust suits. And you did start seeing antitrust suits just multiplying in the high-tech sector. By the end of 1998, we saw the emergence of the first Silicon Valley PAC. What's a PAC? Political Action Committee, a lobby group. So all of these guys quickly figured out that the game is not just played in the economic marketplace. It's also played in the political marketplace. And they started funding election and re-election campaigns and started spending a lot more money on the political process. Okay? Now this is all money, of course, that's not going to be spent, therefore, on improving their products and trying to better appeal to their customers. It's wasted resources. Okay, all right, let's see how we're doing on time here. Wow, we're way behind. All right, so let's talk about the Austrian approach towards regulation. So all this stuff, capture theory of regulation, that's all great, I think, but it was actually preceded by Mises. You know, Mises knew it all. You gotta love Mises to pieces, right? And Mises, in 1929, there was not one of the books that was not on your list, but sorry, 1927 rather. He came out with this book. It was actually a compilation of different pieces that he wrote, and it's called The Critique of Interventionism. And in Critique of Interventionism, he lays out his theory that ended up being named the dynamics of interventionism subsequently. All right, so this idea of dynamics of interventionism, Mises starts off by looking at, and so remember, 1920, in 1922, he has these major critiques of socialism. And they're just devastating, devastating critiques of socialism. A lot of people say, okay, well, maybe we don't want to have full-blown socialism, but we want to have the third way. There is always this appeal of the third way, the rational middle ground between socialism, pure socialism, and pure capitalism, right? The regulatory capitalist state. And Mises, this is what Mises calls the interventionist state, right? He defines interventionism, by the way, as using discretionary powers of government to address supposed problems with the private ownership of production. Using discretionary powers of government to address supposed problems with the private ownership of production. And I'll just read you this quick quote. He says, intervention is a decree which forces the entrepreneurs and capitalists to employ some of their factors of production in a way different from what they would have resorted to if they were only obeying the dictates of the market. Okay, so it's a decree that forces the entrepreneurs and capitalists to use their resources in a way different than who wants them to do? Consumers. Okay, so we have consumer sovereignty in a free market. Interventionists are saying consumers are stupid. We know better what they need. So we're going to pass these interventions to make sure that consumers get not what they want, but what they need. Again, cue ominous music. Right? Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg in New York comes to mind most recently. So Mises points out that with interventionism, we fall into this mixed economy, the third way, right? Not a laissez-faire system, but also not socialism, which is marked by state ownership of all means of production. And the idea is that with limited interventionism, the society can avoid the problems, right, quote unquote, of pure laissez-faire economy. And he says, look, interventionists make three presumptions. Right? They think, first of all, that interventionism is a stable alternative economic system. That's usually how it's presented, right? Okay, well, you know, we don't want socialism. We're kind of uncomfortable with pure capitalism. So let's have this third system. Like I said, the middle ground, right? Aristotelian golden mean. So that's the first presumption. The second presumption is that government is capable of identifying, correctly identifying the market problems right? These problems of market failures, and constructing a program of limited interventionism that would fix those problems. Okay, so let me just repeat that. The government is, so the second presumption of interventionists is that the government is capable of identifying market problems, correctly identifying market problems, and prescribing a program of limited interventionism to fix those problems. It has to be limited interventionism, otherwise it's socialism, right? If it's unlimited interventionism, we're no longer in this middle way. We're full-blown in the socialist category. And then the third presumption that the interventionists make is that the government is free of influence of interest groups as well as self-interested behavior of its own agents. Okay, so the government is free of the influence of special interest groups and the self-interest of their own agents. Basically, the third assumption says the government's run by angels. Right? Here's where it gets interesting. Mises actually says, and Anthony actually referred to this in another argument. Mises says, okay, in the socialist calculation argument, he said, if you had everybody that's a true believer in socialism, right, socialism still couldn't work. This is what Mises does with critique of interventionism as well. He says, we don't have to have believers in socialism. We have to have angels that are really trying to just do good. If you have angels, it's still doomed to failure. Right? So let's accept that the government's run by angels and then show how it still won't work. Not that Mises believed, of course, that government is run by angels. His point was that even if it's run by angels, forget it, it's doomed, right? If it's run by real flesh and blood human beings, well, then it's completely doomed. There is absolutely no chance, all right? But so he actually agrees with the interventionists on, that as soon as you cross over the hallowed threshold of government buildings, you are transformed somehow. You are no longer self-interested. You just care for the people, right? You love the people now. Yes?
What do you mean by doomed? Like doomed?
Okay, well, let me explain that. So here's how the dynamics of interventionism proceeds, all right? Here's the argument that Mises makes. So government sees something in the marketplace that they don't like. And remember, these are angels, okay? So they care. They really want to do good. God save us from do-gooders. So they're trying to make things better. And of course, we live in an imperfect world. Humans are quite imperfect. See, we're never going to be in a utopia. There are always going to be certain problems in any real-world society. So there's plenty, of course, to point to and say, well, that stinks. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do something about that, right? But the point is that when we see displeasure with something in the marketplace, we already have some people that are almost certainly trying to figure out how to make that better. Who are those people? Besides the do-gooding angels, do-gooder angels. Who else?
Entrepreneurs.
Entrepreneurs, that's right. Because you don't make money by entering a market or an industry where everybody's already happy. Good luck to you with that, right? You make money as an entrepreneur when you enter those sectors of the economy where people are really frustrated and unhappy, right? That's where the opportunities for profit are. And you will make profit by actually improving the lives of consumers, right? Making their lives better. So there are already entrepreneurs. You can bet on that. Whatever problems we face in a society, there are already entrepreneurs that are looking at those problems and trying to figure out how they can fix them. But the government says, we can do it. So they go barging in like a bull in a china shop, right? Stuff crashing everywhere. What does that mean? The point is this. When they intervene into a particular market, what they're going to do, first of all, is they're going to have a very blunt instrument, right? Law. That's what they do. And law, of course, has the force of coercion behind it. That's how government is differentiated from all other social institutions. They have the legal monopoly over the use of force, right? So they go in, they pass a law. But inevitably, they're going to miss some things. Because as we know, we are all quite ignorant. Remember my lecture from yesterday? Natural human condition is to be ignorant. And again, I do not mean that as an insult. No, I don't mean it pejoratively. I mean it descriptively. It's a matter of fact that even the smartest ones of us know very little of everything there is out there to know. So if you have just a few people that design a particular law, even if they're angels, they're still not omniscient. They may be omnibenevolent, right? They really want to do good, but they're not omniscient. And because of that lack of knowledge of why a particular problem in a society is a problem, they're going to miss some things. They're going to miss, in fact, almost certainly they're going to miss how economic agents are going to respond to that intervention. Because what we do know is that people, when you change the circumstances, people do not continue to behave in the same way that they did before. People change their responses. And almost inevitably, with every government intervention, the presumption is that people will continue to act as they did previously, which they never do. People change their behavior, and they change their behavior in a way that almost inevitably the legislators, the interventionists, will not expect, will not anticipate. And inevitably also what we'll do, these unintended consequences will end up creating a situation which is undesirable from the perspective of the interventionists themselves, who, once again, I emphasize, are angels, right? And they're going to look at what they've done, and they will say, it is not good, right? Unlike the Lord, they will say, ooh, oops, didn't see that coming, darn. Mises points out, at that point, they have two options. What are those two options?
Undo it or make more.
Good. They can get rid of the initial intervention, let the entrepreneurs fix the problem, whatever it may be. Or double down, right? Say, all right, well, we didn't get it right this time, but the next time, we're sure to get it right. We know more now. So they engage in a second round of intervention. What happens as a result of that? The same. They will miss something else. People will respond in ways that they did not anticipate. And they will create an even bigger mess. Once again, confronting them with two options. Do we get rid of the whole thing? Or do we introduce new interventions that are fixing now the unintended consequences of our previous interventions? Right? And because they're do-gooders, and they're angels, and they want to, make it better for us, they will say, yes, we can do better. Here we go again. And you have this downward spiral where one intervention builds more and more on the previous interventions, creating just a mess, really, a big old mess. Meanwhile, they're always saying, you see, it's the market's fault. Meanwhile, you have these highly regulated markets, right? You can barely call them even a market at that point, like the financial sector, for example, all right? There is very little market competition left in the financial sector of the United States. It's the most regulated sector. Arguably, you could point to a couple of others, but I use this for my money and banking class. I used the leading textbook in the US. This guy actually was a governor at the Fed that wrote the textbook. His name is Frederick Mishkin. And Mishkin in that textbook says that the financial sector of the US is probably the most regulated part of our economy. Okay, so this is not just some libertarian crazy, right? I mean, this is a guy that's really part of the mainstream, that's part of the system. And he even says that. So this is why it's so laughable when you have the lefties in 2008 saying that the crisis is due to lack of regulation or deregulation. It's like, what deregulation? What are you talking about? You know, the last deregulation happened in 1999. It really was not that big of a deal. So, but nevertheless, this is what they would point to and say, yes, we need more regulation. Thus, you get the Dodd-Frank bill, which I think was, what, 2,000 pages, if I remember correctly? Just gigantic. Okay, so Mises's point, how much time do I have here? Okay, just a few minutes. Mises's point is that we have these dynamics of interventionism where one intervention breeds further intervention. And this all happens in a democratic society, right? It happens as we're trying to steer this course between Scylla and Charybdis, right? Go through the middle, and good luck with that. So Mises's point is that this is not a stable system. Ultimately, as you pile on one intervention after another, you're going to have to come to a point where you're confronted with a choice between going full-blown into socialism, true socialism, or stepping back from the brink, right, getting rid of all these regulations wholesale, and reverting back to some kind of a rational market economy. Okay, so Mises actually, back in 1927, how long ago is that? 85 years ago, I guess? 85 years ago, he predicts. So he, 7 years before that, he predicts that socialist states will fail. Which, of course, even like the socialist economist by the name of Robert Heilbronner, highly respected, when the Berlin Wall fell and then Soviet Union fell, Heilbronner had an article in, what the heck was it, the magazine, New Yorker magazine, where he said Mises was right, okay, in 1992. Well, what we're about to find out is that Mises was again right when it came to interventionist economies, right? And everybody laughed at him for decades. They thought, oh, crazy old coot, like, what is he talking about? The democratic system of, pitting the government power against business power, that's the way to go, right? Progressivism properly understood. Well, nobody's laughing over the past 4 years. People are looking at this and going, yikes, Mises was right. You hear that a lot, all right? And just a couple of quick examples of this dynamics of interventionism. One, you can just look at, once you have that sort of a mental model, once you possess it, as you start looking at almost anything that's happening in any economy, right? Go to your own home economy and just start looking at it. It's really hard to miss this kind of a pattern, this sort of a dynamic, right? Very quick 2 examples since I'm basically out of time. Rent control in the US. Right, so you have rent control. So very small example, I'll give you a much bigger example. Bunch of cities around the US implemented rent control where they said supposedly that housing is becoming unaffordable to the poor. So we're going to put a price ceiling on the housing, right? Cap on how much you can charge as a landlord for rent. All right, now what's going to happen? Well, if you've had any kind of economics, if you know supply and demand model, it's going to create a shortage, right? You're going to have a shortage because now quantity supplied is going to be considerably smaller than, or somewhat smaller than quantity demanded. Which results in what? When you have a shortage, what do you observe?
Prices go up.
No, prices are not allowed to go up.
Discrimination.
Right?
Also a little bit rational.
No, first, lines. Right? When there is a shortage, you're going to see lines. People waiting to get a particular good or whatever service. So you have landlords that are saying, okay, well, we can't raise our prices anymore, but we can decide who we're going to rent to. So they're going to go down the line and say, I don't like the looks of you. You have the wrong skin color, right? Wrong color eyes. You're out. All of a sudden, there's no cost to discriminating. And discriminating on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, whatever, right? All of a sudden, landlords can indulge in their preferences, whereas there was a price for that before. If the ethnic or racial group that you dislike was the person that was actually willing to give you the most money for your apartment, if you didn't rent the apartment to them, you would lose money. And that's when, you know, people's racism starts getting questioned. How much do I really care, right? If I'm going to lose some money here, $100 a month or whatever. Maybe I don't really care that much. You see? So the government says, well, wait, we didn't mean to do that. So you had like New York City, rampant discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. And you start seeing really apartment buildings and things like that becoming very separated, right, by ethnicities and by race. And they say, well, no, we can't have that. So they pass laws forbidding discrimination, right? Well, laws forbidding discrimination now leads to blossoming of bribery, as all of these people are basically just giving under the table payments, right? So then they clamp down on bribery, and now landlords are saying, okay, I don't get to pick who I want, can't accept some under the table payments. What can I do? Well, I have this line of people waiting to get my apartment. I don't actually need to keep the apartment in good order. Why would I replace the carpet, for example? Because whatever state the carpet is in, there's still going to be plenty of people that want the apartment, right? If there's a broken window, well, that's not my problem. I'll still be able to rent out the apartment at the mandated price. So all of a sudden you start getting what? Slums, right? Landlords abandoning their property except for collecting rent checks, right? Gradual degradation of all of these buildings. So we have slums created. Now the government's scrambling to somehow solve the problem of slums. So that's dynamics of interventionism. Another very quick example, medical care in the United States. Okay, kind of a big issue right now. But if you look at how we got into the current mess, I mean, it's laughable when people justifying Obamacare say that, well, we can't let the markets do this. Markets have failed. Look at the runaway costs. It's like, what? What markets? Where are there markets in healthcare? Okay. Here's what's happened in the U.S. You had, again, going back to World War II, we had a situation where, of course, we shipped off millions of young men across the two oceans, right, to fight the war. And what happened to the labor supply in the U.S.? Whew. What do you think is going to happen as a result of such a massive overnight shrinking of the labor supply?
Reducing tax revenue?
Well, that's one of the impact, but wages are going to go up, right? I mean, wages are going to go sky high. Well, the government was actually nationalizing the entire industry, basically, during World War II, and they did not want to pay high wages. So they actually instituted wage controls. But that didn't solve the scarcity of labor, like I talked about yesterday. Just because you light a match on the thermometer, that's not going to make it warmer in here, right? So you have a situation now where businesses still had to attract labor. Well, how did they attract labor without being able to offer higher wages? They had started providing all sorts of non-pecuniary benefits, non-monetary benefits, right? And health insurance became a very popular one. So you get this wage that's government mandated, but we'll sweeten the pot a little bit by offering you also health insurance. And after the war, the government looked and said, it is good, right? And they started doing what? Taxing the business provided insurance differently than if you buy health insurance yourself. You basically get a tax break when the businesses provide your health insurance compared to if you just get it yourself. So we created a situation where almost everybody in the US started becoming extremely dependent on their business provided health insurance. And if you change jobs, or if you were laid off or even fired, at the time when you are most economically vulnerable, you don't have health insurance. Like, what? What sense does that make? That's just completely ridiculous. At the same time, almost everything started, the government kept expanding what the insurance should cover, right? Now there is a big argument over, in fact, there's a federal court that's now put a stay on Obamacare, this part of Obamacare, that forces insurance companies to cover birth control, right? And a lot of Catholic organizations are not very happy about that. I wonder if this college itself has a few things to say about that, right? But that's what the government has done, constantly mandated greater and greater coverage. But that means that recipients of healthcare services will become completely insensitive to costs because there's a third payer. Somebody else is paying, right? So we want only the best. I mean, if you go to the hospital, good luck with trying to even find out how much something costs, right? I mean, if you actually go into a supermarket, imagine going to a supermarket without any prices being posted. That's the kind of a system we've created with healthcare. So each time there was this problem, so the costs started going up, the government would then intervene further and impose price limits on this, and government will provide these services, and et cetera, et cetera. And we get to the point where it's so expensive that a lot of people can't afford it anymore, right? And now we get Obamacare, which is really doubling down on interventionism, right? Going full bore. And once again, this dynamics of interventionism in full force. So you can see thousands of other examples. If you just study any of these history of interventions, of regulation, it's going to be pretty striking. But I think I better stop. I'm probably over time. We can discuss any of this further during the discussion sessions, or if you have questions, I'm available now. All right, so thank you very much. I'll see you in 10 minutes.